The riverlands had a smell. It was the smell of places where too many people had died too recently for the earth to have fully processed the fact. A deep, iron copper heaviness that lived underneath the mud and the rain and the wood smoke, that seeped up through the soil the way old memories seep up through sleep. The fields between the burned villages and the broken holdfasts had been turned over by boots and hooves, and the dragging of bodies so many times that the ground no longer looked like ground. It looked like something that had given up trying to be anything other than a record of what had happened to it. John Wick landed in it face first at approximately 3 in the morning. So he was conscious before he finished falling, some combination of trained reflex and the particular neurology of a man whose body had learned to treat every transition between states as a potential threat. And he rolled, absorbing the impact across his shoulder and back the way he had absorbed thousands of impacts before. And he came up in a crouch with the Glock already in his right hand and his left hand braced against the mud, and his eyes doing in 2 seconds what most people's eyes could not do in 20. Threat assessment, perimeter check, exits, darkness, tree line 30 yards north, ruins of a structure, farmhouse collapsed, burned some weeks ago based on the weathering of the char, 20 yards west. A road, unpaved, running east-west, currently empty. The sky overhead with no moon, and more stars than he had ever seen over any city, which meant he was not in a city, which meant the light pollution of civilization was either absent or very far away. He was alone. He stayed in the crouch for another 4 seconds, listening. Wind, insects, the distant sound of water moving over stones, nothing mechanical, no engine noise, no distant traffic, no ambient electrical hum of the kind that existed below conscious hearing. In every corner of the modern world he had inhabited for his entire life, nothing. He stood up slowly and he looked at where he was, and John Wick, who had fought his way through the Continental, through the Ruska Roma, through the High Table's entire enforcement apparatus, through a man with a knife in a hotel kitchen who had taken a pencil away from him and learned to regret it, felt the specific, unpleasant cognitive dissonance of a man whose internal map has just been rendered completely useless. This was not New York. This was not anywhere he had ever been or read about or been contracted to operate in. The stars were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not science fiction wrong, but subtly, fundamentally wrong in the way that a face is wrong when it belongs to someone you've never met, but who resembles in bone structure and bearing someone you lost. The air pressure was slightly different. The smell of the earth was slightly different. The quality of the darkness was slightly different in the way that darkness is different in places that have never had electric light, where the night is the actual original night and not a managed approximation of it. He checked his inventory with the systematic efficiency of a man who had learned that inventory was the difference between alive and otherwise. 2 Glocks, one in hand, a one in shoulder holster, with combined 17 rounds remaining. 1 tactical knife, fixed blade, right boot. 1 folding knife, jacket pocket, no phone, no backup obviously, since backup presupposed a world that contained the people who would constitute it. A single continental gold coin in his left jacket pocket, which he registered with the particular quality of attention reserved for things that had recently detonated reality and deposited him in a field. Then he looked at the coin for a moment. Then he put it back in his pocket and started walking east, because east was the direction the road went, and roads led to people, and people led to information. And John Wick, without information, was dangerous in the way a loaded weapon pointed at the floor is dangerous, passive, but only because it hadn't yet been aimed. He found the village 2 miles east as the sky was beginning to gray. It was alive. which distinguished it from several of the other settlements he had passed. A handful of structures around a central well, smoke coming from 2 chimneys, a small sept with a cracked bell that someone had attempted to repair with rope. The people who emerged to draw morning water looked at him with the expression that people in traumatized places wear when they see a stranger. Not curiosity, not welcome, but the calculating assessment of individuals who have learned that strangers bring new versions of old problems. He looked like a stranger worth assessing. The tactical clothing was wrong for this world in ways he was already cataloging. Wrong materials, wrong cut, wrong everything. And the weapons visible on his person were unlike anything these people had encountered, which he registered from their eye movements, and the particular way 2 men near the well positioned themselves without appearing to position themselves. Not aggressive, preparatory. The body language of people who had survived enough violence to maintain permanent readiness without letting it show. He respected that. He approached the well with his hands visible and his pace unhurried, the universal language of non-aggression, which translated across every cultural and temporal barrier he had ever encountered. And he asked in English for water. They didn't speak English. This was the first genuinely new problem. He had operated in 43 countries. He spoke 6 languages with operational fluency and had functional competence in 4 more. None of them were whatever these people were speaking, which had a rhythm and a root structure that his linguistic training couldn't grab purchase on. He spent 3 minutes attempting cognates, attempting gesture, attempting the slow and slightly humiliating process of communicating through mime that he was not a threat and was very thirsty, and eventually a woman of approximately 60 who had watched this entire performance from a doorway with an expression of comprehensive unimpressedness, came forward and handed him a ladle from the well. He drank. He nodded. He said thank you in 6 languages, and none of them landed, but the tone did, which was the part that mattered. He spent 2 hours in that village communicating in the only truly universal language available to him, which was demonstrated competence and patient observation. He watched. He listened to conversations he couldn't understand and extracted from them the parts that didn't require translation, the hierarchies, the fears, the names that made people's voices change when they said them. 3 names came up repeatedly in tones ranging from contempt to terror. He filed them. He watched the village's dynamics and identified, within 40 minutes, that the large man near the granary was the informal authority figure, that the 2 younger men near the road were functioning as informal sentries, and that the village had been burned at least twice in the past year, based on the differential weathering of the rebuilt structures versus the surviving ones. These were people who had been used as pieces in someone else's game. He recognized the type. He had been a piece in someone else's game once. He had opinions about it. He was preparing to leave, to continue east and find a larger settlement where the information density would be higher. When the riders arrived, there were 8 of them. They wore the colors of a house he didn't know yet, a sigil he hadn't cataloged, and they rode into the village with the particular swagger of men who had ridden into villages this way before and encountered no meaningful resistance. Their leader was a broad man in his 30s with a sword at his hip and the easy, comfortable cruelty of someone who had been permitted to exercise it so frequently it had stopped feeling like cruelty and started feeling like management. They wanted grain. They communicated this to the large man near the granary with a combination of repetition, volume, and the universal administrative gesture of pointing at what they wanted and then pointing at their horses. The large man communicated back that the grain was the village's winter supply. The rider communicated that this was, in the most fundamental sense, not his problem. John watched this exchange from near the well, still and quiet, his right hand loose at his side. He was not, in any technical sense, involved in this situation. These were not his people. This was not his world. He did not know the language, the politics, the history, or the specific calculus of risk and consequence that governed interactions between armed men on horses and unarmed villagers in whatever this place was. The operationally correct decision, the decision consistent with his training, with his experience, with the basic arithmetic of a man alone in an unknown environment, with 17 rounds and no backup, was to remain uninvolved, to continue gathering information, to find out where he was before he started making enemies. Now, he watched the rider grab the large man by the front of his shirt. He watched the man's daughter, 12, 13, standing in a doorway, make a small, involuntary sound. He watched the rider turn and look at the girl with the specific, assessing look that John Wick had seen on the faces of men who had made the last mistake of their lives and not yet understood that was what they were doing. John exhaled once. Then he moved. The first rider didn't understand what had happened to him. This was not unusual. Most people didn't in John's experience. The transition from functional to non-functional was generally faster than the brain's ability to process it. And what registered was not the specific mechanics of a judo throw executed at full speed against a mounted opponent, but simply the fact that he was suddenly on the ground and something had gone profoundly wrong with his right shoulder. The second and third riders registered the first one going down and made the reasonable military assessment that the situation required immediate escalation, and they drew swords, and John shot them both, 1 round each, center mass, with the clean, unemotional precision of a man performing a task he has performed so many times it has become artisanal. The sound of the gunshots did something to the air. It was not the sound of anything these people had ever heard. It was too sharp, too final, and too modern. A sound that did not belong in this landscape the way a power line does not belong in a Renaissance painting, technically impossible and yet unavoidably present. The remaining 5 riders froze in the specific way that people freeze when their brains encounter a stimulus for which no existing category exists. John used the freeze. He was among them before it ended, moving through the geometry of 5 mounted men with the fluid, almost architectural efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped thinking about individual opponents and started thinking about spaces, the space between the second and third horse, the space opened by a rider turning to track movement, the space that existed for exactly 1.5 seconds when a man on a horse was committed to a downward sword stroke and could not redirect. He used the knife for 2 of them. He used his hands for 1. The last rider turned his horse and ran. And John let him go because letting one run was not mercy. It was communication. It was a message in a language that required no translation. 8 seconds. 3 dead, 2 incapacitated, 3 fled. He stood in the center of the village and checked his weapons and breathed normally and waited for his heart rate to return to baseline, which took approximately 12 seconds and had always been one of the things that set him apart from other men who did what he did. The villagers stared at him. He looked back at them with the expression he always wore, which was not the expression of a man who had just killed 3 people, but simply the expression of a man who was waiting to see what came next. The woman of 60 who had given him the ladle looked at him for a very long time. Then she said something in her language that he didn't understand, but the tone of it he understood perfectly. It was not gratitude exactly, it was the older, more complicated thing that lives underneath gratitude, the thing that surfaces in people who have been waiting without knowing they were waiting for someone to arrive and demonstrate that the world contained a force that did not operate on the same terms as the one currently grinding them into the mud. It was recognition. John picked up his spent casings from the ground. Habit, discipline, operational hygiene. And he put them in his pocket, and he nodded at the woman once. And he walked east. Behind him, the village was already telling the story, already shaping it into something that would travel faster than he did, passing from mouth to mouth along the King's Road and the river crossings and the burned fields of the Riverlands. A story about a man in strange dark clothes who had ridden into nothing, who had moved like water and killed like silence, who had left 3 bodies and no name. Westeros had a word for that kind of story. It called it a warning. If you want to see more legendary figures walk into worlds that weren't built for them, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see next in the comments below. The Baba Yaga has arrived, and Westeros has no idea what it just let. Word traveled faster than horses in Westeros. Not literally. Horses covered ground at speeds that walking men could not match, and ravens covered ground that horses couldn't. But the kind of word that moved through the Riverlands in the weeks following the incident at the village traveled through a different network entirely. It moved through the channels that official communication never used and could never fully monitor. The conversations between stable boys at different keeps, the whispered exchanges of traveling merchants sharing a fire, the particular currency of information that flowed through the servants and the small folk, and the invisible administrative layer of people who kept the great houses functioning and were, by virtue of their invisibility, privy to everything. This network, informal, decentralized, surprisingly efficient, was the closest thing Westeros had to the information infrastructure John Wick had spent his career operating within. He found it within a week. His name in this world became the Dark Man first, then the Silent Soldier, and eventually, in the rougher establishments along the King's Road, where men who did violent work for other men gathered and drank and compared professional notes. Something closer to what he actually was. The language barrier had not dissolved, but it had become negotiable. He was learning. He had always learned languages the way he learned combat systems, not academically, not through structured study, but through total immersion and the brute force method of treating every interaction as a lesson that cost you something if you failed it. Within 10 days, he had functional comprehension of the common tongue. Within 3 weeks, he was speaking it with an accent that people kept trying to place geographically and couldn't, and a precision that made the people he spoke to slightly uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. The discomfort of realizing that someone has learned your language as a tool rather than a home. What he was learning alongside the language was the structure of the world. He gathered it the way he had always gathered intelligence, methodically from multiple sources, cross-referencing against each other to identify where the accounts diverged. Because divergence was where the truth lived. He sat in common rooms and listened to arguments. He paid for information with the gold coin from his pocket, which was worth more in this world than it had any logical right to be. The gold was purer than anything Westerosi mints produced, and the men who examined it did so with the expression of people who had encountered something that exceeded the upper boundary of their reference frame. He let them keep their theories about where it came from. The theories were useful. They contributed to the story that was already building around him, and the story was a resource. The political geography assembled itself in his mind with the clean, structural clarity of an operational briefing. 7 kingdoms, now 6, now arguable, under a king who was dead, now a boy king who was also dead, now a queen regent who was consolidating power with the particular ferocity of a woman who understood that the window for consolidation was narrow and intended to use every second of it. A throne made of swords. He had to hear this detail 3 times before concluding it was literal. which said something about this world's relationship with symbolism that he filed under useful cultural data. So great houses operating as independent power centers within a nominally unified political system, not unlike the table's structure actually, the parallel so clean it was almost schematic. A shadow economy of information and leverage and violence running beneath the visible political one, operated by a man called Littlefinger, who had started with almost nothing and built, through the systematic exploitation of other people's secrets, a network that touched every major power center in the kingdom. John spent a long time on Littlefinger. He found the brothel in the crossroads town, not because he was looking for a brothel, but because brothels in every world and every era he had any knowledge of were where information pooled. They were structurally the same institution as the Continental, neutral ground officially, where the currency was discretion and the actual product was access. The men came to brothels and left their armor at the door, and armor in this context meant the careful political performance that every person of consequence in a stratified society maintained as a survival mechanism. Without the armor, they talked. Without the performance, they revealed. And the people who ran brothels, who managed the information environment and the physical space and the complex human dynamics of an institution premised on the temporary suspension of consequence. Those people were, in John's experience, the best intelligence sources in any environment. The woman who ran this one was called Roslyn. She was approximately 40, with the specific quality of stillness that develops in people who have spent decades managing volatile situations without the option of walking away from them. She looked at John when he entered with the professional assessment of a woman who had seen every kind of dangerous man and had developed, over years, a fairly reliable taxonomy of which variety was which. She saw something that didn't fit her taxonomy. He sat down at a table in the corner with sightlines to both the entrance and the back corridor, ordered wine he didn't intend to drink, and waited. She came to him rather than sending someone, which told him she was intelligent. "You're the dark man," she said, not a question. "People keep calling me that," he said. 8 men in the last fortnight have ridden through here telling stories about you." She sat across from him with the ease of someone who owned the chair. The stories don't agree on the details, but they agree on the broad facts. "What do the broad facts say?" "That you move wrong," she said. "That you fight wrong. That you came from somewhere that isn't anywhere anyone can name. And that men who make the mistake of treating you like a problem tend to become a problem themselves. Specifically the kind of problem that requires burial." John looked at her. "I'm looking for information," he said. "Everyone in here is looking for information," she said. "The question is what you're willing to pay for it." He put the gold coin on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. Then she picked it up and examined it with the practiced eye of someone who understood the value of things independent of their official designation. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Everything," he said, starting with Littlefinger. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a name lands in a room with more weight than the speaker knew they were putting behind it. Roslyn's expression didn't change. She was too experienced for her expression to change involuntarily. But something in the quality of her stillness shifted. The difference between a person who is calm and a person who is performing calm. That's a name that tends to shorten the lives of people who say it carelessly, she said. "I don't say anything carelessly," John said. She studied him for another moment. Then, with the decisive efficiency of someone who had spent a career correctly reading situations and acting on the reading, Petter Baelish controls the grain of information that flows through every establishment like this one between here and King's Landing. He doesn't own them. He doesn't need to. He owns the people who own them, or he owns something those people would prefer he didn't have. The distinction stops mattering at a certain point. He runs an information network, John said. He is an information network, she said. The man doesn't move without 3 people knowing where he's going before he arrives, and 2 people knowing why after he leaves. He trades in secrets the way other men trade in grain or iron. He's been doing it since before most of the current lords were born. John absorbed this, and the people who collect information for him, how do they identify themselves? A pause. They don't. That's rather the point. They always identify themselves, John said. The method changes, the fact doesn't. What's the currency here? What's the equivalent of a marker, a coin, a declaration of house? She looked at him with an expression that had acquired a new layer, the particular look of a person recalibrating someone upward in their estimation. You've done this before, she said. In a different place, he said. She told him about the mockingbird sigil, about the specific phrasing used in certain business transactions that functioned as identification between Littlefinger's network nodes, about the 2 men currently staying in the establishment's upper rooms who had arrived 3 days ago, asking questions about a dark man with strange weapons who had been moving east through the Riverlands. John looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. Which rooms? He said. He did not kill Littlefinger's men. This was a deliberate choice, and it was the kind of choice that required more discipline than killing them would have. Because killing them was easy, was instinct, was the correct tactical resolution in a world where leaving threats operational was the kind of operational error that compounded. But he was not in his world. He was in a world where he had no institutional standing, no network, no continental to provide neutral ground, and where every body he left behind contributed to a profile that was becoming visible to exactly the kind of man who was most dangerous when he had good information. Littlefinger had good information about everything, but John went upstairs and knocked on the first door, and when it opened, he had the man turned around and sitting down and extremely uncomfortable before the man had fully registered that the door had opened. He did not threaten him. He did not perform menace. He simply occupied the room with a quality of presence that communicated without requiring language, that resistance was a choice available in the same way that stepping off a roof was a choice available, technically possible, but definitionally voluntary and comprehensively inadvisable. He asked questions. The man answered them, which was the correct decision. He learned 3 things of immediate operational value. 1. Littlefinger knew John was moving east and had deployed 6 observers along the King's Road to track him. 2. Littlefinger had sent a private message to King's Landing describing John as a potential asset of unknown origin and requesting instructions. 3. The instructions had come back in 2 days, which meant someone in King's Landing was paying close attention and had opinions about what John Wick should be used for. He left both men alive, bewildered, and with the specific, clear memory of a man who had told them with absolute calm that he would know if they sent a raven in the next 12 hours and would factor their decision into his subsequent choices. He was back downstairs and out the door in 11 minutes. Roslyn watched him leave from behind the bar with the expression of a woman revising significantly upward her estimate of the coming month's complexity. He reached the Crossroads Inn 2 days later and found Littlefinger waiting for him. Not in person, Littlefinger was not, apparently, a man who met operational uncertainties in person, which John respected as a survival philosophy, even as he noted it as a psychological data point. He had sent a representative, a slight, careful man in nondescript clothing, who was sitting at the inn's main table reading nothing and watching everything, and doing both with the practiced invisibility of a professional who had been doing this long enough to be genuinely good at it. The man saw John come in and did not react, which confirmed he was a professional. John sat down across from him without being invited. The man looked up from his not reading and assessed John with the compressed efficiency of someone running a rapid calculation. Then he placed a piece of folded parchment on the table between them. John looked at the parchment, then at the man. "He wants a meeting," the man said. "I know," John said. A pause. "You'll come." John picked up the parchment and looked at it. A location, a date, a seal he didn't recognize yet. He put it back on the table. "Tell him," John said, that I don't take meetings, I take contracts." The man blinked. "Lord Baelish doesn't—" "Tell him," John repeated, with the patient, absolute finality of a man who has said the important thing and is simply waiting for the other person to accept it. The representative looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood, and he took the parchment, and he left. John ordered food and ate it and watched the room and thought about Littlefinger, about a man who had built an empire on the principle that everyone had a price, who had spent decades inside a system where the currency was information and leverage, who had never in his life encountered a variable he couldn't eventually quantify and monetize. He thought about what it would look like when a man like that met something genuinely outside his pricing model. Outside, the Riverlands were doing what they always did, burning, grinding, bleeding, and the small folk were doing what they had always done in response, which was surviving it by any means available and telling each other stories about the rare, impossible moments when something arrived in their world that the great lords couldn't account for. The story about the Dark Man had reached King's Landing, in the Tower of the Hand, in the small hours of the morning. Miss Cersei Lannister read the description and felt, beneath the armor of her contempt for anything she hadn't personally commissioned, the faint and deeply unwelcome sensation of something she had not felt since childhood. She felt like something was coming that she didn't have a plan for. She reached for her wine and drank it and told herself the feeling was nothing. In the Riverlands, John Wick finished his meal and left 2 coins on the table and walked out into the evening. And the road to King's Landing stretched east before him like a sentence waiting to be finished. The boy's name was Edwin. He was 11 years old, the son of a miller from a village 2 miles east of the Crossroads Inn, and he had attached himself to John with the specific, unself-conscious determination of a child who has identified something he wants and has not yet learned the particular adult skill of talking himself out of wanting it. He spoke 3 words of what he called the old tongue, the language of distant lands. He learned from a traveling septon who had passed through his village twice. And John spoke approximately 400 words of the common tongue, and between these 2 inadequate vocabularies and a shared talent for communicating through gesture and expression and the kind of pointed silences that made people feel understood rather than dismissed, they had arrived at something functional. Edwin was useful. He knew the roads. He knew which tollkeepers were in whose pocket. He knew which inns served food that wouldn't kill you and which ones would. And he knew the difference between Lannister soldiers and Lannister soldiers on a specific kind of mission, a distinction that had proven, twice now, to be the difference between an avoidable encounter and an unavoidable one. He translated when John's common tongue stalled. He explained the sigils, the hierarchies, the web of obligations and insults, and inherited grievances that governed every interaction between the great houses with the detailed, exhaustively cross-referenced knowledge of a child who had grown up listening to adults talk about things they assumed he wasn't tracking. John was not, by any conventional standard, a man who formed attachments easily. He was aware, with the clinical self-knowledge that had always been one of his more functional qualities, that the thing he felt about the boy's continued presence was not affection in any soft or sentimental sense. It was closer to what he felt about a well-maintained weapon, appreciation for reliability, a certain satisfaction in competence, the specific quality of trust that develops between two people operating in difficult conditions who have each proven that they don't panic and don't lie. See, he left Edwin at the Crossroads Inn on the morning he went to deal with the Lannister checkpoint 3 miles west, left him with instructions to stay inside, to eat, and to talk to no one about the dark man with the strange weapons, delivered through the combination of mime and broken common tongue that had become their shared language. Edwin nodded with the serious, focused attention he brought to all of John's instructions. He understood that the instructions were not suggestions. John was gone for 4 hours. The checkpoint took 11 minutes. There were 6 soldiers and a sergeant who had been extracting unofficial tolls from travelers for long enough to have developed the comfortable assumption that this would continue indefinitely. The assumption did not survive contact with John, though 2 of the soldiers did, which John considered proportionate. He left them with the specific but accurate understanding that reporting this encounter to their commanders was an option that carried consequences he had taken the time to describe with some precision. He came back to the inn to find the stable boy standing in the road, with the expression of someone who has been waiting to deliver information they don't want to deliver. He knew before the boy spoke. Why, he knew in the way that people who have lost things before know, not through information but through the prior knowledge that loss is available, that the world contains it, that the specific arithmetic of caring about something in a dangerous place always resolves toward a certain kind of answer eventually. He knew with the cold, flat, and precognitive certainty that he had felt once before in his life, when he had come home to a puppy and a letter, and understood in the first second that the second thing explained the absence of his wife and the presence of the first. He walked inside. A Lannister patrol had come through 2 hours after he left. Not the checkpoint soldiers, a different unit, 8 men under a commander called Sir Harwin Lydon, a knight of minor consequence attached to a Lannister bannerman house, a man distinguished primarily by the practiced ease with which he exercised authority over people who couldn't refuse it. He had wanted horses. The inn's owner had horses. The transaction had proceeded in the manner of all such transactions in the Riverlands in this period, with the asymmetric efficiency of people who had swords taking things from people who didn't. Edwin had been in the stable. He had been in the stable because he had been tending John's horse, the one John had acquired from the 3rd Lannister soldier at the checkpoint 2 weeks ago, through the same negotiation process that had yielded the man's sword and his better boots. And when the patrol arrived and began taking animals, Edwin had done what 11-year-old boys with more courage than tactical sense sometimes did. He had objected. Sir Harwin Lydon was not a man who responded well to objections from small folk children. The response he had offered was brief and definitive, and had left Edwin in the stable straw with a head wound that the inn's owner had done what she could for, and a stillness that had been present for the full 2 hours since. John sat beside him for 6 minutes. He did not perform grief. He did not speak. He sat with the boy in the straw, and he was quiet in the way that he was always quiet, completely, without the fidgeting or the displacement activity that grief usually produced in people. And he stayed with the specific, unacceptable fact of it until it was fully present in him and no longer required processing. Then he stood up. He asked the inn's owner 2 questions: where Sir Harwin Lydon's patrol was headed, and how long they'd been gone. His common tongue was precise enough now that she understood him without effort, and she answered with the expression of a woman who had learned that certain questions from certain people were not the beginning of a conversation. They were 40 minutes ahead of him on the road to Harrenhal. He caught them in 90 minutes. What John Wick did to Sir Harwin Lydon's patrol on the road to Harrenhal was not a battle. A battle implied two sides with comparable agency, with the mutual capacity to determine outcomes, with the essential reciprocity of a contest. This was not that. This was something more like a systematic correction, a methodical, unemotional, technically precise process of resolving a problem that began at the patrol's rear and moved forward through it with the efficiency of a mechanism that had been designed for exactly this purpose and was currently operating without interference. He used 4 rounds, not because 4 was the minimum required. 3 would have been sufficient, and 2 would have been sufficient for a less disciplined man operating under less control. But because the 4th shot was the one that would have been difficult, the angle wrong and the target moving, and John Wick did not take shots he wasn't certain of. He took the 4th shot and he made it, and the count was 4. He used the sword for the rest of them. The Lannister sword he had been carrying for 2 weeks, learning its balance and reach and the specific way its weight distributed through the arc of a swing, which was different from every blade he had trained with and which he had been treating as an ongoing education in applied medieval metallurgy. It was a good sword, heavy by his preference but well made, and in the hands of a man who had trained in 37 distinct combat disciplines, a heavy sword was an inconvenience rather than a limitation. Sir Harwin Lydon was the last one. The knight had the presence of mind to dismount and draw and face John directly when it became clear that running was not a viable option. And John acknowledged this with the small, genuine respect he extended to anyone who chose to face something, rather than flee it, regardless of what they had done to earn the confrontation. He was afraid. John could see that clearly. He was afraid in the way that men are afraid when they have spent their careers being the most dangerous thing in any given situation and have abruptly encountered evidence that the category was always larger than they knew. "Who are you?" Lydon said. His voice was controlled. "Soldier's discipline." John looked at him. "The man whose boy you killed," he said. He said it flatly, without drama, or without the theatrical weight that men in this world seem to attach to declarations of grievance and intent. He said it as information, as context, as the single relevant fact that explained everything that had happened in the last 90 minutes and everything that was about to happen in the next 30 seconds. Lydon swung first, which was the right instinct, even if it wasn't enough. John moved inside the arc, and what followed was brief and complete, and left Sir Harwin Lydon on the road with the certain knowledge in the final moments of his consciousness that he had encountered something the world he lived in had no name for. John recovered his spent casings. He cleaned the sword with a cloth from one of the saddlebags. He took the horses, 6 of them, which was more than he needed, but which would slow any pursuit by removing the patrol's mounts from the equation. He turned them loose 2 miles east into open pasture. He walked back to the inn as the sun was going down. The story that traveled ahead of him after that was a different kind of story. The Riverlands had been telling stories about the Dark Man for weeks, accumulating, spreading, growing in the way that stories grow when they are nourished by confirmed facts rather than speculation. But the story that left the road to Harrenhal was not the story of a dangerous stranger. It was the story of a specific kind of dangerous stranger, the kind that the small folk of the Riverlands, who had been learning for generations the difference between men who were dangerous because they had power and men who were dangerous because of what they were, recognized in a register that went deeper than politics or allegiance. This was the Baba Yaga story, the oldest kind. The kind where something comes out of the dark that the lords and the knights and the men with swords and horses cannot account for, and it does not come for the throne or the gold or the land. It comes for one specific thing, and it does not stop until it has it. Cersei received the report in the early morning, written in the cramped, precise hand of a Lannister intelligence officer who had clearly been disturbed enough by what he was documenting to write more words than the format required. She read it twice. Then she sent for Qyburn because Qyburn was the person she sent for when she encountered things that conventional advisors were not equipped to assess. Qyburn read the report with the focused, interested attention of a man who found the world's strange offerings genuinely stimulating. "He's not political," he said. "Everyone is political," Cersei said. "No," Qyburn said, with the gentle certainty of a man correcting a category error. "Say most people are political because politics is the system through which they pursue what they actually want. This man pursues what he wants directly. Politics is invisible to him, not because he's unintelligent, but because it's not the relevant system." Cersei looked at him. "And what does he want?" Qyburn set the report down. "At the moment, he wants Sir Harwin Lydon, who is, based on the timeline, already dead." "And after?" Qyburn considered. That depends on who else makes the mistake of giving him a reason." Cersei stood at the window and looked at the city below her and thought about a man moving through the Riverlands who could not be bought or threatened or redirected through the ordinary mechanisms of power. Every tool she had, gold, information, armies, the name Lannister itself, nay, which had functioned as a deterrent for 3 generations, was calibrated for a world where everyone wanted something that could be negotiated with. A world where fear of consequence shaped behavior. A world where the right combination of reward and threat could redirect any variable toward a useful outcome. She thought about what it meant that none of those tools applied. "Find out what he wants," she said, "before he gets to King's Landing. And if he won't say..." She turned from the window. "Then find out what he loves," she said. "Everyone loves something." Qyburn picked up the report again and read the line about the miller's boy, about a child who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, about a patrol that had been exercising routine brutality in the routine way, about a man who had covered 40 minutes of road in 90 minutes to correct an injustice that the great lords of Westeros would not have registered as worth noting. "I think," Qyburn said slowly, "that may be precisely the problem." Outside the Red Keep, in the city below, a raven arrived from the Riverlands with a sealed message that 3 different handlers would later describe as having made them feel cold when they touched it, which was nonsense, obviously, and which all 3 of them believed completely. In the Riverlands, John Wick buried Edwin in a field overlooking the mill where the boy had been born, in ground that was still half frozen and required 2 hours of work with a shovel he had taken from the patrol's equipment. He did not say anything over the grave. He was not a man who talked to the dead, because the dead were gone and the talking was for the living, and the only living person present was the one who had made a decision that he now needed to execute. He stood at the grave for 2 minutes. Then he turned and he started walking toward King's Landing. And something in the quality of his movement had changed. Not in speed or efficiency or the external mechanics of how he moved through the world, but in something internal, something that the people he would pass on the road would feel without being able to name. The difference between a weapon being carried and a weapon being aimed. The difference between a man on his way somewhere and a man who had decided. He still had 13 rounds. He intended to be conservative with them. King's Landing was the largest city John Wick had ever seen that he immediately understood. Not architecturally. The scale of it was foreign. The smell of it was foreign. The sound of 50,000 people living in medieval density was a sensory register he had no prior calibration for. But structurally, systemically, in the way that a man who has spent his life moving through the shadow architecture of power recognizes power's shadow regardless of what face it's wearing. He understood it within 4 hours of entering through the gate of the gods with a merchant convoy whose leader had asked no questions in exchange for the kind of quiet, watchful escort that had prevented 2 attempted robberies between the Riverlands and the capital. Every city of consequence had the same bones. There was the visible city, the markets, the guilds, the sept, the administrative machinery of governance that processed the ordinary business of existence and gave the population a functional reason to believe that someone was managing things. Then there was the invisible city, the network of people who moved information and leverage and violence beneath the visible layer, who serviced the needs that the visible city officially didn't have and unofficially couldn't function without. In New York, this had been the Continental, the High Table, the elaborate code of markers and coins and debts that governed the shadow world. In King's Landing, it was Littlefinger's network, Qyburn's Whisperbirds, the gold cloaks with their supplemental income streams, the brothels and the gambling dens, and the information brokers who operated in the specific, lucrative space between what the great lords knew and what they wanted to know. Different aesthetics, identical architecture. He found a room in a boarding house in Flea Bottom, the part of the city that the people who managed the visible layer preferred not to look at directly. And he spent 3 days learning the invisible city the way he had learned every operational environment he had ever worked in. He watched, he listened. He paid for small pieces of information with small coins and assembled them into large pictures with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 20 years. He identified Qyburn's observers within 36 hours. They were good, but good in the way that people trained within a specific system are good, which meant they had blind spots shaped exactly like whatever the system hadn't thought to account for. He let them observe him doing nothing of interest. He moved his actual operational activity to windows of time and geography their rotation pattern didn't cover. On the 3rd day, Littlefinger came to him. Not a representative this time. The man himself arriving at John's boarding house in the middle of the afternoon with the casual confidence of someone who considered information the equivalent of armor and believed himself thoroughly protected by it. He was slight, precisely dressed, with a pointed beard and eyes that moved through the room the moment he entered it with the automatic professional inventory of a man who thought primarily in angles. He sat without being invited, and he looked at John with the expression of someone who had spent considerable resources developing a comprehensive briefing on a subject and was now experiencing the particular intellectual pleasure of comparing the briefing to the reality. "You're not what I expected," Littlefinger said. "No one is," John said, a small smile. "I've been told you don't take meetings, only contracts." "That's right, and yet here we are." "You're in my room," John said. "Yeah, I'm sitting where I was sitting. This isn't a meeting. This is you coming to me." The smile remained, but something behind it recalibrated. The eyes moved over John with a new quality, not threat assessment. Littlefinger clearly did not think in those terms, but the specific reevaluation of a man who had expected one kind of intelligence and encountered another. "Fair point," he said. "Then let me be direct. I know what you are. Not specifically. Your origin remains genuinely obscure, which I find refreshing, but categorically, you're an operator, a professional. You work within a system of contracts and codes, and you're extraordinarily good at the violent end of that system." John said nothing. "I want to hire you," Littlefinger said. "For what?" "Cersei Lannister." He said it with the flat, matter-of-fact delivery of a man ordering something from a menu. "She's becoming a structural problem. Her consolidation of power is disrupting the natural balance of the realm in ways that are bad for commerce, bad for stability, and specifically bad for certain arrangements. I've spent a considerable time building." He paused. "I understand you already have reason to visit the Red Keep." John looked at him. "The patrol," Littlefinger said. "Sir Harwin Lydon was attached to House Prester, who answers to the Lannisters. By the logic of the system you apparently operate within, the contract traces upward." It was, John acknowledged internally, a reasonably accurate reading of how culpability functioned within the High Table's framework of accountability. Not perfect, the High Table's rules were more granular than that, but structurally sound. Littlefinger had done genuine analytical work. He had taken incomplete information about a foreign system and extracted a functional model. That was not nothing. "You want me to trace the contract upward?" John said. "I want you to do what you were already going to do," Littlefinger said. "And I want to pay you for it, which makes it tidier for both of us." John was quiet for a moment. "And what do you want in return, beyond Cersei?" "Information," Littlefinger said, "about whatever system you come from. A network that produces men like you is a network I want to understand." John looked at him for a long time. "I'll think about it," he said. Littlefinger stood, straightened his doublet, and moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "One more thing," he said. "Qyburn has something in the Red Keep, a project, the Mountain. You'll have heard the name." He said it with the specific, casual delivery of a man placing a piece of information precisely where he wanted it to land. "I mention it because whatever Cersei's other vulnerabilities may be, Sir Gregor Clegane is the one she considers definitive. If you intend to make an impression, the impression requires addressing him." He left. John sat in the boarding house room and thought about what had just happened with the clean, effectless analytical focus he brought to all operational assessments. Littlefinger was using him. This was not a surprise. Littlefinger used everyone. It was his primary mode of engaging with the world. The question was not whether he was being used, but whether the use was compatible with what he had already decided to do. And the answer to that was mostly. The direction was right. The destination was right. The payment he had no interest in. The information trade he had even less interest in. He thought about the Mountain. Then he checked his weapons, both of them, with the thorough and tactile attention he had always paid to the instruments he relied on, and he went to sleep. He went into the Red Keep at 2 a.m. through a drainage access point that Qyburn's records, acquired through a gold cloak sergeant whose supplemental income had made him very forthcoming, identified as unmanned between midnight and the watch change at 4. He moved through the lower levels with the particular quality of silence he had spent 20 years developing, which was not the silence of absence but the silence of complete control. Every footfall placed with full conscious intention, every transition between spaces preceded by a precise calculation of angles and sightlines and the acoustic properties of the specific stonework he was moving through. He had 13 rounds and 1 knife and the Lannister sword. He had a precise understanding of the Red Keep's layout from 3 independent sources. I cross-referenced and resolved into a single working model that he had spent 2 days memorizing with the same focused repetition he applied to all operational preparation. He had a list of 4 names. The first 2 were administrative, Qyburn's primary intelligence officer and the Gold Cloak commander who had received and processed the order that sent Lydon's patrol through the crossroads. He found them in the order their locations dictated, and he moved through both encounters with the compressed, clinical efficiency of a man executing a plan that had been fully resolved before the first step. Not because they deserved less than his full attention. Everyone in a hostile environment deserved his full attention, but because they were infrastructure. They were the machinery through which the decisions that mattered had been processed. And dismantling machinery was a technical problem, not a personal one. The third name was Sir Gregor Clegane. Qyburn had rebuilt the mountain into something that was not entirely a man anymore. John understood this in the first 2 seconds of the encounter, which began in a corridor outside the lower barracks, when 8 feet and 400 pounds of reanimated violence stepped out of a doorway and filled the available space with the specific quality of presence that things without functioning self-preservation instinct tend to have, which was the quality of complete indifference to consequence. The mountain did not assess threats. It did not calculate. It moved toward opposition the way water moves toward low ground, with the blind, total, a geological commitment of a force that has had all its doubt removed, along with most of its original personality. John shot it 4 times, center mass grouped within a 3-inch circle, because even in the middle of the Red Keep at 2 in the morning, his groupings were what they were. The mountain kept moving. John was already moving too. Not away, sideways, because sideways was how you stayed out of the path of something that large while maintaining the angle to keep working the problem. He had encountered opponents who didn't go down from center mass before. He understood the tactical response. You changed the problem. You found the specific mechanical vulnerability, and you addressed it directly, and you did this quickly because a thing that size, if it got its hands on you, ended the conversation in a way that couldn't be walked back. He used 6 rounds total. The first 4 established that the chest was not the answer. The 5th was the knee, specifically the lateral aspect of the knee joint, the mechanical nexus point, which even in a body that had been substantially modified, remained a functional vulnerability, because the physics of bipedal locomotion were non-negotiable regardless of how much of everything else you changed. The mountain went down to 1 knee. The 6th round was the base of the skull, fired from 6 inches, in the precise location that Qyburn's own notes, which John had read in the same acquisition session that had given him the drainage map, identified as the point where the reanimation process was most concentrated and most vulnerable. The mountain stopped moving. John stood over it and breathed for 4 seconds, and then moved on because the Red Keep was not going to wait for him to finish processing the last 3 minutes. He found Cersei in her solar. She was awake. She had been awake since the first gunshot, which had been 2 floors below her and muffled by stone, but unmistakable. That flat, percussive sound that her intelligence reports had described repeatedly and which she had told herself was an exaggeration until she heard it and understood it was the opposite. She had not run. John noted this as he came through the door and found her standing in the center of the room, not reaching for a weapon, not backed against a wall, but standing in the center of the room with the particular, terrible composure of a woman who had decided that if this was the end, she would meet it in the manner she had met everything else, straight, looking at it directly. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You're not here for the throne," she said. Her voice was steady. "No," he said. "The boy in the Riverlands," she said. It wasn't a question. Liddon reported to Prester. Prester reports to you." "Every knight in the Westerlands reports to me," she said. "I cannot be responsible for everything "Yes," he said. "You can." The word landed in the room with the weight of something that had traveled a long distance and finally arrived. She absorbed it. He watched her absorb it, watched the calculation behind her eyes, the assessment, the search for the lever that didn't exist, the moment when she found the absence of the lever and understood what it meant. "What do you want?" she said. "There must be something. Everyone wants something." John looked at her for a long moment. In the shadow world he came from, there was a code. The code existed because without it, there was only chaos, and chaos was bad for business, and bad for everyone inside the system, and eventually bad for the system itself. The code said you could do almost anything, but there were lines, and the lines existed because some things, if they were permitted, if they became normalized, if they entered the calculus of acceptable behavior, unmade the fundamental operating agreements that made everything else possible. Killing children was a line. It had always been a line. In every organization, every shadow government, every continental and every city he had ever operated in, that line was consistent and absolute, and the reason it was absolute was not sentiment. It was because a world where that line didn't hold was a world where nothing held. And nothing holding was not a world that worked for anyone. Cersei Lannister ran a kingdom. In this kingdom, a knight had killed an 11-year-old boy for objecting to the theft of a horse. And the knight had done it with the comfortable assurance of a man who knew that no one who mattered would object. Jon looked at Cersei. "Nothing," he said. "I don't want anything." He said it without anger, without drama, without the theatrical delivery that men in this world seem to consider the appropriate register for moments of consequence. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, flatly, completely, as simple information about the state of the world. Her composure broke once at the end, which was more than most people managed. He was out of the Red Keep before the first gold cloak reached Cersei's solar. He was out of King's Landing before the sun came up, moving northwest through the pre-dawn dark with 2 remaining rounds and the sword and the single continental gold coin in his jacket pocket. Behind him, the city was waking to the particular disoriented chaos of a world where the organizing principle had been abruptly removed, where the mechanisms of power were still present, but the will at the center of them was gone, leaving a vacuum that would be filled, as vacuums always were, by whoever moved fastest and cared least about the legitimacy of what they were filling it with. Littlefinger would move fastest. Jon had left him a message through Roslyn, the brothel keeper from the crossroads who had given him the ladle and the intelligence and whose network touched Littlefinger's at 17 points he had identified. The message was brief and had no signature, which Littlefinger would understand completely. It said, "The contract traces upward. I traced it. We're even." It was not an invitation to correspondence. He walked north because north was away from King's Landing, and because the road north eventually reached the wall, and beyond the wall there was wilderness, and John Wick had always, when given the choice between wilderness and civilization, found wilderness easier. Civilization required you to care about its rules. The wilderness only required you to be competent. He had 2 rounds. In a world without gun shops, without ammunition manufacturing, without the entire industrial infrastructure that produced the tools he had spent his life mastering, 2 rounds was an asymptote approaching 0. He knew this. He had known it since he arrived and had operated accordingly. Conserving rounds, shifting to blade and hand whenever the geometry permitted, training himself progressively on the Westerosi sword the way he trained on everything, which was to say, obsessively, and in whatever spare moments the operational tempo allowed. He was not worried about the ammunition. He had been the weapon before the guns. He would be the weapon after them. 3 weeks north of King's Landing, camped at a fire in the hills above the neck, he took the gold coin from his pocket and looked at it in the firelight. It was the same coin, the same impossible purity, the same weight, the same symbols on its face that no one in this world could read, and that Jon could read in the way that you can read something in a foreign language that you learned as a child and mostly forgot, partially, incompletely, with the constant awareness that the full meaning was slightly beyond reach. He had destroyed the Elder Coin that brought him here. He did not know if this one could take him back. He suspected it couldn't. The anchor was gone. The dimensional infrastructure that had connected his world to this one had detonated rather than maintained, and what remained in his pocket was a relic of a system that no longer had a live connection to him. He had considered this. He had processed it in the complete, unsparing way he processed all unpleasant operational realities. He was here. He might be here permanently. The appropriate response to that was the same as the appropriate response to every other circumstance he had ever found himself in. Adapt, operate, survive. He put the coin back in his pocket. The fire crackled. The hills were quiet. Somewhere to the north, through the wilderness and the ancient magic of the wall, there was an army of dead men moving slowly toward a world that had no idea how to stop it. John Wick had no particular feelings about armies of the dead. He had feelings about one thing, which was the specific non-negotiable line that some people crossed and some people didn't, and which the world he now lived in seemed to cross constantly, casually, without apparent awareness that the crossing had consequences. He had demonstrated those consequences once. He would demonstrate them again as many times as necessary, with whatever tools the world provided. He was not a hero. He had never been a hero. The heroes had causes and ideologies and the particular, sustaining fire of belief in something larger than themselves. He had a code. He had a skill set. He had the kind of grief that had long ago finished being acute and become instead a quality of his existence. Present, load-bearing, the structural element that everything else was built around. He had 2 rounds and a sword and a dead boy's memory and the absolute granite certainty of a man who has resolved his relationship with consequence. He fed the fire and he watched the darkness to the north, and he thought about nothing in particular. In King's Landing, in the chaotic days that followed Cersei's death, the stories were already multiplying, the way stories do when facts are sparse and the facts that exist are extraordinary. The Dark Man, the Silent Soldier, the ghost who moved through the Red Keep like death on an errand, who killed the unkillable Clegane and left the throne room empty and was seen by no one and stopped by nothing and left behind only bodies and the specific, reverberant silence of a place where something irrevocable had happened. The small folk had a name for what he was. Not the Dark Man. Not anymore. Something older. Something from the stories that predated the Andals and the First Men and the written history of the realm. Something from the oldest layer of the culture where the stories were about forces rather than people. They called him the Consequence, the thing that came when the line was crossed. And in the hills above the neck, feeding a fire in the dark, the Consequence ate a cold meal and sharpened a borrowed sword and rested for tomorrow with the practical, unromantic discipline of a man who had work left to do and intended to be capable of doing it. The road north waited. The coin in his pocket caught the firelight once, briefly, and went dark. The great game continued as it always had, the houses maneuvering, the alliances forming and fracturing, the throne changing hands with the mechanical indifference of a world that had learned to treat power as weather, something that happened to you rather than something you chose. But something had changed in the calculus, not obviously, not in the language of politics or military strategy or the formal architecture of power, in something quieter and more durable, in the specific wordless understanding that moved through the small folk and the servants and the invisible layer of people who kept the visible world running, the understanding that had no official status and no institutional expression and which was, nonetheless, the most consequential political fact in the realm, the understanding that the line existed, that crossing it had a cost that could not be bought off or threatened away or restructured through negotiation, that somewhere in the hills north of King's Landing, a man in dark clothes was moving through the world with 2 rounds and a sword, and the absolute patient certainty of something that did not require an army or a throne or a name to be the most dangerous thing in any room it entered. The great lords would forget this, as great lords always forgot things that didn't fit their models. The small folk would remember it the way they remembered everything important, in stories, in the specific tone of voice used to tell certain stories late at night, in the silence that followed the telling. And when the line was crossed again, as it always was, as it always would be, when the knights came through the villages and the children were in the wrong place at the wrong time, the silence would have a shape, a name, the consequence, still moving, still north, still waiting for whoever was next. May the force be with you. More stories await.